Greetings, retro lover. This is Ethan, aka the Ghost Mall. Back to you again from my home studio here. I produce retro music. In particular, I produce 80s and early 90s retro synth pop style music and soundtrack style music. And in this video, what I wanted to do for you is another one of my episodes of Retrowave music production. This is going to be a deep dive into a track that I have produced, and I'm going to tell you all about how I went about getting the retro sounds of the track. In particular, I'll talk about the songwriting process, the arrangement. I'll talk about the particular instruments I used. This was produced, as most of my music is, entirely in the box, using VST instruments and VST plugins. So just all computer-based, but it is definitely possible to get the sound of the 80s out of a modern computer if you're using the right tools and you know what you're doing with respect to composition. So yeah, so this is going to be a deep dive into another tune. This song is called After Hours, and it is a Retrowave instrumental track. It's not a vocal track. And I think that the key takeaway lesson I wanted to kind of lead with on this particular video, and that I want you to take away from this video, is that sometimes when it comes to songwriting and composing, simplicity is king. You know, we've all heard the phrase, keep it simple, stupid, right? And while I think that's pretty harsh, actually, I definitely think it's valid because simplicity is beauty in a lot of cases. And we tend to overcomplicate things when it comes to creating art a lot of the time. And I find that if I set myself limits, it really forces me to be more creative and make more interesting decisions. And I've talked about that in a few previous videos, but to me, simplicity is one of my key sort of pillars of songwriting and composition. And this song is a really good example of that, I think. Right now, you should be seeing my screen here in my DAW. This is my old DAW, Cakewalk Sonar Platinum, before they kind of went belly up. But as you can see here, this is the whole session right here. We've got 10 channels going. Now, one of these is a drum set, so there's definitely more than 10 instrument parts going on at the same time, but it's a pretty simple arrangement. And as a general rule, I like to limit myself to really, generally, I mean, I bend this rule occasionally, but my preferred way to go about it is to keep all of my songs, including vocal tracks, below 32 tracks. You know, the standards used to be in old analog recording studios, and of course, I'm trying to mimic a sound from a few decades ago, that at the most, you know, you might have an 8-track tape machine and you could stack a few of those. So a 24-channel studio would be pretty common. Maybe you have an additional one. Maybe you have a 32-channel studio. That was really ample back in the day. Now, of course, you could bounce and find other ways to increase the track count, but I often find that we do that to our detriment when it comes to songwriting and composition. And some of the reasons why are because the human ear and mind can only handle so much new information at a time. And Max Martin, one of the most successful songwriters of all time, is famously said that he likes to introduce one new element at a time, in the same way that a playwright might have one new character come on stage, or a screenwriter might have in a movie one new character come on at a time, because if a whole crowd of new characters comes on at the same time, you're never going to know who everybody is. So Max Martin suggests each new instrument come in at its own time and get a little featured moment. And you can't do that if you have, you know, a 60, 70, 100 track kind of an arrangement. And furthermore, I think that the fewer elements you have, the more space you can give them to shine, and also to give them a personality, you know, give them some kind of character. And so, yeah, that's one of my axioms for songwriting. And I think I wanted it to be kind of what I lead with and the main takeaway from this video. Simplicity can really get you very far. Because actually this song, which I almost thought was maybe too simple to release when I was done, I was like, maybe I need to expand this more, but I did. I released it anyway. And it's become one of my most listened to songs in terms of when it was put up and the pace at which it's picked up lots of listeners. And so, yeah, that encouraged my philosophy of keeping it simple. But before I talk anymore and break down the instrumentation, the arrangement, how I mixed, mastered, I'll go into all of those details from A to Z in this video, but let me play it back to you from beginning to end so you can get a feel for the song, and then we'll break it apart. So here we go. This is After Hours. All right, and there it is. That is the complete version of After Hours, a Retrowave instrumental tune that I composed here in Sonar Platinum. And as you could see, as we were kind of rolling through the song, it really is just a handful of instruments, in particular when you take into account that there were a couple of different instruments that I use more than once in this session. And so, before talking about how I came to choose what sounds for what parts and how I constructed it from the melody to the rhythm and all of the sort of what I call ear candy, etc., I think that it's really critical to talk about something that gets left out of the equation sometimes in these sort of technical videos, which is the inspiration for the song and the atmosphere of the song. I'm a really big person on atmosphere and on the emotional content of a song, the emotions that it evokes. Because as I mentioned in a few previous videos, I'm a huge believer that really songwriting and music in general is all about the emotion. What emotion are we conveying in this song? To the extent that we can convey that all the elements convey that one solitary singular emotion together and reinforce each other, that's going to be a stronger song. And something that Edgar Allan Poe called the unity of effect, that every single component of a piece of art should work together to convey a certain feeling. And that means that music can really convey complicated, sort of ambivalent and feelings that are maybe we don't feel every day. It's not just I'm happy, it's not just I'm sad. It's something a little more sophisticated and complicated than that. It has a different flavor. And so for me, the inspiration for this, for After Hours, was, as you know, I go by the moniker The Ghost Mall. And people who know me and who've followed the project for any length of time know that I'm really inspired by what we call dead malls, or sort of vacant or abandoned retail spaces, because to me they're kind of time capsules of the eras that I'm inspired by and trying to replicate, like the 80s and the early 90s when I was growing up. When I was a kid, malls were the places where everybody gathered. They were the sort of hubs of civic life in towns and cities, and they had a lot of life to them. And to see them now with so little life is a really striking contrast, and I think says a lot about the change in era, and it really heightens the nostalgia for me for the 80s and the early 90s. And so I was picturing in my head sort of what it would be like after hours, after closing, in one of these sort of vacant retail spaces. And that was the inspiration for the song. That was the atmosphere I wanted to convey, something that was kind of quiet and mellow. That's why I didn't think the song would really work well with lyrics. Something sort of chilled out and relaxed, sort of magical, and also maybe something a little elegant, picture one of these retail stores like Saks or Macy's, or, one of these fancy places, and the mannequins sort of hanging out after hours, decked out in the finest of clothing. So that was the atmosphere I wanted to evoke with this song. And let's start talking now about the process of writing a song. In my mind, I've kind of got things boiled down to not a science exactly, but definitely a method for writing songs, and a sort of sequence that I generally go through. That helps me expedite the process and just makes the process flow more easily. And it's not something that I was really taught. It's something that after writing many, many, many songs, I've sort of identified as a pattern. So to begin with, I used to, when I was writing songs, really begin with the chords. In this arrangement here, you're going to see everything's color-coded, and let me just explain that really fast because it's pertinent here. Red, for me, are always drums and percussion and maybe effect samples. Blue is the bass. Green are instruments that play chords that sort of comp out the harmony. Could be an electric piano, could be a pad. Purple stuff are what I call the ear candy, the stuff that dresses up the arrangement, that if it was missing, you wouldn't be missing a song, but it really adds to the atmosphere and the vibe. And then the gold down here, this is the melody. Okay, so for the longest time when I was writing songs in my younger days, I always started with chords. Whether I was back in the day when I was primarily a guitar player, I'd sort of just strum out chords until I found a sequence of chords I really liked. Now I'm more of a keyboard player, you come up with a neat chord progression, and that's a fine way to begin songwriting. And in fact, I think it's probably a more common way to begin the songwriting than what I'm going to propose next. However, making the shift into this change that I'm about to describe was one of the best things I've ever done as a songwriter and a composer. And that is that nowadays, almost all the time, I begin the songwriting process with the melody. And well, why is that? Why is that a beneficial change? Why is that cool? Because you can come up with a cool chord progression. There's no doubt about it. But really, if you are to break down a song into its most fundamental components, stripping away everything that you can until you get to a point where, like, if I strip away more, it's not a song anymore. Well, what you'd be left with is the melody, and if it's a vocal song, the lyrics. And that is still a viable song. I have a little kiddo at home. I have a little girl, and I spend a lot of time singing songs and lullabies to her. And, that's just me and my voice singing some traditional old melody and some, lyrics, but that's still a song. It still has an emotional effect. And that goes not just for children, but like for all of us. Like, that's still a song. If you stand up and sing your national anthem, or a holiday carol, or some pop song that's really well known, people would still know that that's the song. Okay. A chord progression doesn't necessarily make a song. And in fact, there are many, many songs that share similar or identical chord progressions. So I begin with the melody to try to come up with the most memorable melody I can. And that has an advantage beyond just the melody, though. What I've discovered is that it actually forces me into a place where I come up with more interesting chord progressions. And one of the things that I really love to do that has been a great exercise for this kind of practice is that I like to remix songs, and to do so by completely reharmonizing against the melody. So right now I'm working on a remix, as a matter of fact, for a modern pop song, and doing it up in my typical Retrowave style. I've done, I don't know, 5, 6 of them now. And what I like to do is listen to the actual released version as little as possible, so that I'm not influenced by the chord progression, and then try to build up the most interesting, unique, and maybe sometimes a little bit surprising and off-kilter chord progression that I can around the vocal melody. And when I play back my remixes versus the original song, a lot of the time, I've come up with almost completely different chord progressions often. So that's my current method, is to begin with the melody. These are the melodies down here. It's really a melody on track 9, and then another instrument that doubles it at certain points. And then subsequently to come up with chords around it. So that's what these green tracks are here. That was the approach that I took in this song. And it's something that if you haven't tried, I encourage you to give it a try, because it has that dual benefit of helping you come up with a more memorable melody and sometimes more memorable and unique chord progressions. Okay, so let's start by, I'll play you back some of these instruments so that you can start to hear how this sort of came together. All right, and as we go, I'm going to tell you all about the instruments themselves and how they represent the time period I was trying to go for, the 80s, and also the processing I did on them if you're interested in mixing and mastering and stuff. Okay, so first things first. This is the main melody. And this is sort of the A section. It repeats and varies a little bit. And then we get to a B section here. I'm going to turn off some of the ambient sound, ambience here, the delay and reverb. That's better. And then we're back to the A section. Okay, so that is the main melody throughout the song. And from a composition standpoint, when I started playing that, what that is that's in an A minor pentatonic scale. I think it's A, yeah. A minor pentatonic scale in any case. And what that sounds like to me, and it might as well to you, is it has a very sort of Asian sound to it. And that is because in countries like Japan and also even before that in China, a lot of traditional Chinese and Japanese music is based on a variety of pentatonic scales. Pentatonic meaning a scale with 5 notes in it. And of course, pentatonic scales are used in many other kinds of music. And, if you expand upon that by just one note, you have our blues scale. So it's certainly by no means just evocative of Asian music, but for me, it kind of often is. And so I've done a couple songs this last year that incorporated that kind of motif into it and the pentatonic scale. I released a song I've talked about on this channel called Bullet Train Bombshell, which has a similar kind of scale basis for it. But anyway, that was the main melody. And then I wanted to come up with some kind of way to harmonize it. But before going into that, let me just tell you about this instrument and why I chose this sound. So it's a very chimey sound. One might think that it was even maybe a old school digital synth, but actually what this is here is UVI's UVX80 synthesizer. And what this is it is a replica of Akai's AX80, which was an 8-voice analog synth from 1984, I think. And so even though this particular patch has kind of a digital sound to it, this is actually an analog synth that you're hearing, a 2-oscillator synth. And this UVX80 I used in more than one place in this arrangement. So a large portion of the sound also comes from the effects here, the delay and reverb, which I turned off. But here you can hear it. It really creates a lot of space and ambience and a lot of drama around it. And here would be a good point to mention something that's kind of interesting about, again, keeping it simple, not only in the limitations you set yourself and the results you're going for in terms of track count and whatever, but sometimes when I'm trying to compose something quickly, whether it be a remix with a deadline or just because I really want to capitalize on the creative surge I'm having and to get it done fast, this isn't my preferred way if I had all the time in the world, but I won't, go in and create aux sends for my reverb and my delay necessarily. Sometimes I will just put them as inserts on the channel, or sometimes I will actually just go with the built-in delays and reverbs and other effects if they're part of a patch that I like. So if I found, I stumbled upon this particular preset in the UVX80, I was like, yeah, that'll do for the melody really nicely. And the ambience was working for me. It was actually heightening the sound rather than taking away from it. Sometimes if it ain't broke, I don't fix it. Now, the downside to that is that it means that in the mixing process, that sometimes I have to make compromises. If I wanted to EQ the sound, and I found that, let's say I was adding some highs to the sound, and I was adding highs to the delay that I didn't want, then I might have to finesse that a bit. But in any case, sometimes it's worth that trade-off in order to just sort of keep things moving. And again, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So in this song, I don't think I have hardly any insert or send effects. Instead, I've used the effects within the synths themselves and sort of, where I needed to decrease the feedback or increase the feedback or decay time. Like I think I turned the decay time quite far up on this reverb to make it big. But you get the idea that that's just one method to, it's not, I wouldn't call it cutting corners exactly because it is purposeful, it's deliberate. What it really is for me is just, using what's there if it's working already. All right, so that's the melody. And I'm going to play it from here so you can hear it once by itself, and then that's where it first comes in. Then later it gets doubled by another instrument, and I'll show you that. So this is like the first verse, if you want to call it a verse. I'm going to talk about structure in a minute here as well, but here you go. So right now this is the UVX80 by itself. And then here it gets doubled. All right, so what was that? This is a patch from just a wonderful company and a wonderful library that I use a lot. This is from Super Audio Cart PC from Impact Soundworks. Impact Soundworks makes wonderful libraries, mostly for Kontakt. Everything from really cool world instruments, orchestral instruments, some really unique, very unique actually, instruments if you're doing ambient music and the like. But they have two libraries in their Super Audio Cart line. The regular Super Audio Cart, which is samples from retro video game consoles like the Sega Genesis, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, the NES, etc. And then this was the successor to that, Super Audio Cart PC, which includes sounds from old school PC sound cards and the like. Now, you know me, I love everything retro, and I really am not a snob about this stuff, especially because I do stuff in the box. I don't have really hardly any hardware, but I love the high-end, super, fancy scale stuff, the Roland Jupiter 8s, for example, and the Oberheims, which we'll get to in a second, all the way down to the cheapest stuff, the sound of toys from the 80s and the early 90s. And this is a good example of that. So this sound that doubles the melody here is actually from a Commodore Amiga, the Paula chip. The Paula was the sound chip. It was a 4-channel sound chip on the Commodore Amiga that allowed 4 simultaneous channels of sampled sound. So this patch was called Ethnic Bamboo Flute. Let's hear it again. By itself, yeah, that's a pretty cheesy, cheap sound. But it kind of heightens that Asian feel, I think, and when it doubles up with the UVX-80, it sounds nice. Yeah, so those two instruments are responsible for the melodies throughout the song. And if you're interested in mixing and mastering and that side of things, let me just tell you what I did here. I already mentioned that I'm relying mostly on onboard effects here. For the UVX-80, I don't have a lot of processing going on. This is M-Auto Dynamic EQ, one of my favorite really versatile EQs, but all I'm doing here is a high pass filter, really high. I think I'm like 300 and almost 350 hertz. And it just makes it a lot cleaner. Let's hear it bypassed, and then I'll put it back in. You can just hear it just cleans everything up a bit. Okay, bypassed. So there's the raw sound now with the high pass. Yeah, it just cleans up a ton of low-end stuff that we don't need in this high chimey melody. It's just getting in the way, especially when this is a very kind of a bottom-heavy mix, and I'll get to the kick drum and the bass pretty soon. And then the only other thing going on here is a tiny bit of compression. This is the CLA2A, which is a Waves version of an LA2A optical compressor. And the CLA compressors, which are, by the way, they stand for Chris Lord Alge. These were designed, or rather modeled, after his own gear in his studio. He's a mixing legend, of course. Are some of my favorite compressors. There's the LA2A, the LA3A, and the 1176, and I use them at least a few times on every mix. This is doing very little. It is just taking 1 to 3 dB off, but what it does is it sort of brings the sound together. I didn't want to kill the dynamics in this melody. In fact, if you listen to the song... Oh, and by the way, I'll be making sure to put a link in the description of this video to where you can download After Hours. It's actually, you can get it as a free download from my Bandcamp site. All you have to do is go to the link that I'll include. And when you check out, just put $0. You can get it as a free download if you prefer. But if you like the tune and you want to have it, then it's definitely available for you. But furthermore, if you just wanted to have it to listen back and compare as a tool for learning from this video, please go grab it. But I did want the melody to still have a dynamic range. There are quiet notes and loud notes in this melody. The LA2A is just going to bring it together a bit more. So let me play you a phrase without the compressor, and then I'll turn it on. So now let's listen with it on and see if you can just hear the sound come together a tiny bit. And Yeah, again, it's subtle, but it really just brings up some of the low content a little bit so it's not lost. And one other thing that I did with this, as you can see, there aren't many knobs on an LA2A. Again, keeping it simple because simple can be really awesome sometimes. But one thing that there is this high frequency knob. Now, because the LA2A was developed as a broadcast compressor primarily initially back in the day, they added this feature as a kind of like a de-esser, really. It was to kind of take harsh sibilants that might be in somebody who is speaking on the radio, and if you turn this screw down a bit, it would sort of take out some of the high content. I used that a little bit here because this sound did have a little sizzle on the top. So not only am I compressing the signal a tiny bit, but I'm taking a little of the high end off here. Let's listen to another section here. I have it in bypass, then I'll turn it on. That's bypass, now it's on. Yeah, it takes a little bit of the maybe too harsh top off. Okay, so that is the main melody and how I processed it. Now let's look at the double here. And because I'm going to turn off the processing so you can hear just the raw sound here. Again, it is a very sort of cheesy, cheap kind of sound if you listen to it, but that's okay because it provides contrast. It almost sounds silly, but it provides a little bit of a different texture when added to the UVX80. But by itself, it wasn't quite cutting it. I did have to do a few things. So the first thing here is this is Slate's VMR. All I did was add a little bit of revival. This is basically a 2-knob harmonic exciter, one knob for the higher frequencies, one for the low. And I added a bit of what they call shimmer here to just make it pop out a little bit more. Here's without. Here's with. It just kind of gives it a little more life. Very subtle, but still good. What's not so subtle is this. So this is UVI Spark Verb. This is probably my favorite algorithmic reverb. There's almost nothing you can't do with this, and the range of sounds you can coax out of it is pretty amazing. And so because this is a really ambient song, a really ambient mix, I really wanted to make sure that this instrument felt like it was in a similar space. So this is a huge reverb. Take a listen to this. Listen to all that shimmer and decay. You can see the decay mapping here has gone off the charts, literally, just to really make it feel like it's in a big old space, like maybe like a big old half vacant retail space. So that's all I did for the processing on that. That didn't have any built-in effects. So let's just hear one more time those two melodies together with the processing. All right, so there you have it. That's the melody. Again, that's the heart of the song. That's why I color code the melody as gold, because I consider the melody to be the gold of the song. Now, before moving on to some of the other instrumentation and the minutia of how I processed them and got the sounds, let's talk about the arrangement here. Once I had a melody, an A section and a B section melody, I had some decisions to make. I already knew that I didn't want this to be a vocal song, so I wasn't considering writing lyrics or any of those steps, but that's often the next step. So again, in my process, I begin with the melody, and if it's going to be a vocal song, I may also begin with the lyrics, but that's something I usually return to throughout the arrangement process because the instrumentation will inspire me to finish the lyrics usually. But you begin with the melody and the lyrics, and then you start to harmonize with chords, and from there you can build out an arrangement around that. But I don't like to get too far down that path with just like an 8-bar loop, right? I think that if you're a music producer, you will probably be familiar with the pitfall of falling into sort of 8-bar loop-itis and building sort of like this really tall, deep, layered arrangement of a very short idea, right? That does not a song make. And so I try to really quickly, once I've got a melody, especially if I've successfully come up with at least an A and a B section, I try to roll out the structure of the song. Now, because it's instrumental and and it was conceived as such, I didn't feel as constrained by the typical A B, verse chorus, or verse pre-chorus chorus, verse pre-chorus chorus, and then a bridge and concluding with a couple of choruses. That's your typical song format. Instead, with an instrumental song, I feel like it's okay if you have an A and a B section, you've got enough contrast. So if you can check out up here, this is my markers track here. The way that this is that this section right here is an intro. It's the same chord progression as the A section of the melody, which I've called the theme here, but without any melody playing. So we have that intro. Then we have the first time that the theme, the A section of the melody comes in. And then we have the B section of the melody, which I have as breakdown here. It's the type of turnaround that really would serve more as a pre-chorus in a vocal song. And then it returns to that theme again. And so really what you've got up to bar 34 here is an intro, a theme, the B section, and the A section, the theme again. And it's sort of serving as intro, verse, pre-chorus, chorus, where the verse and the chorus have the same chord progression and the same melody. And then it repeats. This break is the same as the intro. Then we're back to theme as a verse, B section as a pre-chorus, theme as a chorus, theme as a chorus again, just doubled up at the end with a couple little bells and whistles at the end, and that's it. So it's not too far off from a typical verse, pre-chorus, chorus kind of a structure, but it bends the similarity between the verse and the chorus is allowed within this structure. So yeah, so I had the A and the B sections, and from there I just sort of rolled it out. And that all came before adding the bells and the whistles, what I like to call the ear candy. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about starting with the melody. We talked about how I rolled out the structure. Now let's go on to the next section, which is the harmony. So I needed to harmonize that melody. And if you've been following the channel for any length of time, you know me, I really, really have a soft spot in my heart for all kinds of jazz chords with lots of extensions and a lot of warmth, tight voicings, and a lot of just unique voice leading and stuff. So naturally, I wanted to do that. But often in my songs, I tend to my go-to for those types of parts are electric pianos, whether they be Rhodes, something electromechanical, Rhodes, a Wurlitzer, a CP80, or even more 80s, something digital like a DX7 electric piano, full tine, something like that. But I didn't want to do that in this case. I wanted it to be a little more ambient, a little more warm, and so I went with pads instead. Okay, so let's check this out. This is the instrument that plays the chord progression in the intros, the breaks, and the theme sections. What this is the UVXXX from UVI again. And this is basically a replica of the Oberheim OBXA analog synth from around 1981. And it is part of a collection that UVI has called the OB Legacy Collection, which is well represented here. I think I have 3 or 4 instruments from that collection. And what it is a collection of replicas of Oberheim synths. Oberheim had a long, illustrious history creating some of the best and most well-loved analog synths in the 80s. And so this is their OBXA. And this is a pad from that. So let's listen to that. That is the A section, if you will. Let's play it with the melody. A big, warm, thick analog kind of sound. And again, we've got some built-in effects here, which are, I just left them on because they sounded good. Let's listen without those for a second. Still has a nice sustain to it, but the delay and the reverb add to that. Yeah, and that plays the main chord progression in the A segments of the song. It also does a little counterpoint thing here in the B section, which I'll get to later. As far as processing this went, again, very minimalist, very simple, keeping it simple. This was just a technical issue that I had run into. So I noticed that when it was soloed up, or actually rather more pronounced in the mix, let me turn off the processing, and what you can hear is that it sounded like this patch was leaning a little to the left. That is to say, I was getting more out of the left speaker than the right. Here we go. You can even see it on the meter a little bit, because the attack is coming more from the left and the sustain from the right. And maybe that's not a bad thing in and of itself, but it was kind of distracting me. So I used this Channel Tools plugin, and I increased the right side gain by 3 decibels to kind of just balance it out. Now let's listen to that. So yeah, that was just a sort of utility tool kind of a plugin. And then I went to Slate's VMR again. And often, you know, I can go crazy with VMR because there's so many great modules in here to do so many things with. But again, keeping it simple. This is the FGN, which is like Neve style EQ, I guess. I didn't even use the EQ really. All I did was use the high pass filter at 40 hertz to eliminate some of the super lows that we didn't need out of this. And then I really love this. If you engage the drive here, this adds some harmonic saturation. So let me ABU with this off and then back on, and you'll see it just brightens. It just not brightens it really. It just makes it a little more shiny, a little more lively. So here's with it bypassed. And here is with it on. Again, a super simple, super subtle move, but it's these simple, subtle moves over the course of a whole arrangement which really add up to something greater than, you know, the sum of the parts. Yeah, so that was the first pad to play the first chord progression, the A section. And then I really wanted to contrast that in the B section. This is another pad, but it's very different. So let me play you from going from the A into the B, and you can hear the two side by side. Very different, right? And then here, coming up, they play together. To really create a thick sound there, because there's no bass in this section. Right. Okay, so big contrast. This is a shinier sort of pad, and this is from the another part of the OB Legacy collection from UVI. This is the XP12, and whereas the previous one, the UVXXX, was like an Oberheim OBXA, this XP12 is a replica of an Oberheim Expander from 1984-ish, which was like a desktop version of the Matrix 12 analog synthesizer. That synth, even though it's still an analog synth, is known among Oberheim's synths to have a bit of a brighter, maybe even more aggressive kind of sound and tons of modulation options. And so that's what this is really about. That's why I felt like this was a great contrast, because the warmer sound of the OBXA transitioning into the sort of brighter sound of the Expander, I thought was a nice contrast. So on this pad, as you can see, if you come over here to my inspector over here, I don't have any processing going on. The only effects that I have are built in, the delay, filter, and vibrato effects that were turned on with the patch. I don't think I even edited any of those. And I didn't feel the need to high pass or anything, because in this section, there's a lot less going on in the low end, as you'll see, and it was okay to fill it out. So what we have here in the second part, like I said, they layered. The first pad is just playing some single notes in the low part. Underneath the second pad. Yeah, it just creates a really thick, warm, but still shiny sound. All right, so now we have gone through sort of the first two keys in the songwriting process, the melody, and then the harmony built around it to try to be, we wanted the melody to be as compelling and unique and catchy and memorable as possible. And then we wanted the chord progressions harmonized around it to be as unique and inviting as possible. And from there in the songwriting process, assuming that I've established the structure, which I already talked about before sort of getting bogged down in an 8-bar loop, I will go on to my next phase, which is arrangement. And that is to add, again, the bells and the whistles. But particularly, I start with the rhythm section because after the melody, some people would say not even after the melody and the harmony, but just after the melody, that the rhythm is the most important thing. That you could have a melody and a beat and no real chords around it, but still have, a really compelling song. And so let's go next to the rhythm section. I tend to again build the chords out because I'm kind of a chord fanatic. If you've watched either of my retro chords breakdown videos on this channel, you'll know that I'm really into harmony. But let's go next to the rhythm section. Okay, and again, you're probably noticing a theme here, which I've brought up in many of my previous videos, but I'll mention it here as well. In order to create a really truly retro sound, I purposefully limit myself to authentic recreations and emulations of gear that came directly from the time that I'm trying to recreate. So far, I've mentioned to you that this song includes an Akai AX80, Amiga Paula chip, Oberheim OBX-A, Oberheim Expander, and now I'm about to show you a Roland TR-808 drum machine. All of these are mid-80s, and so that definitely helps evoke, even to a person who doesn't know what's happening behind the scenes, even to a person who doesn't know that this was the gear of the 80s, it's going to be evocative to that listener of that time period. It's going to be nostalgic. So yeah, so the drum kit that I chose for this is a Roland TR-808. In particular, this comes from XLN Audio's Addictive Drums Reel Machines. This is just great. What it is it's actually 5 classic 80s drum machines, Roland TR-808, TR-909, a Lindrum, Oberheim DMX, and a Simmons drum set, all recorded to tape. And so it has an even extra layer of retroness. So we've got the drum machines themselves, the sound of the tape. Also, it has a built-in ambience, which is like a retro sounding plate. So this is just a great set of retro drum machines, some of the classics presented in the best possible way. I started with this 808 wet preset, and I'm going to show you some of the key ways I edited it, because what I did to edit it kind of helped make the arrangement here. But it's interesting to note that the 808 is probably the most well-known in pop culture retro drum machine. And that's partly because it became really a staple of hip-hop music, and now even in modern hip-hop music and trap music and stuff, 808 sub-kicks are really a major part of the arrangements. And maybe for that reason, partly also just different reasons, but I really avoided using an 808 in a song for the Ghost Mall up until now. I use TR-707, Oberheim DMX, Linz, a whole variety of stuff. But this was the first tune, actually, that I had used the 808 on because, I just avoid it kind of because of its popularity, I think. And it's an acquired taste. But for this song, where I wanted a sense of space, having a really subby, sustaining kick drum, which is what the 808 is known for, and a kind of snappy snare sounded good to me. So let me just play you back the drum kit by itself. Here we go. So we start off in the verse section with just some of the percussion, some hats, some toms, and a shaker. Then there's that famous kick and the snare. And this is building up to the main theme section here. Sounds pretty good. And let me talk to you now about the main adjustment that I made that really made the kit for me. So listen to the kick against the chords and see if you can tell what special, what's special about the relationship they've got going here. The kick's about to come in right here. What that is that the kick, I have tuned the kick exactly to the fundamental frequency of the key of the song. Right here, this pitch button is activated, and the main knob here has been tuned up a little bit. And I didn't just do that with the kick, I also did it with the toms. So I have tuned the kick and the toms into the key. So they aren't just sort of random notes or hanging out between different note values. They are tuned to the key. And so they're really musical in that respect. One more time, let me play you the segment so you can hear the toms. Actually, here's what I'll do. I'm going to solo up the kick and the two toms. As you can see, if I click through here, they've had their pitch adjusted slightly. This one up, this one down to be in the key. Listen to just the kick, the toms, and the pad, and you'll hear that they're tuned into the key. And I had to do this the old school way by ear because there's no real clear indication on those knobs, like when you're hitting a certain pitch. If you had a tool like, I hear that Wave's Torque plugin is really good for this. You might be able to do it more easily. You could bounce the drums out and then tune them and be really sure they were in pitch, but I had to do it by ear. But I think it really added to the coherence of the arrangement. So yeah, there's just a couple patterns there. Like I said, a simple pattern without the kick and snare in the intro, and then in the A section everything comes in, but in the B section we break it down a little bit. Let me turn back on everything else, or else we're definitely not going to get a clear picture. Okay, going into the breakdown, the B section here. Again, back to just some percussion. Yeah, so just a couple of patterns, making sure that there's variance between the A and the B sections and the breakdowns and the build-ups. But really tuning those kick and toms into the key was really crucial to making the sound of the kit. And also the other thing that really is crucial, because as I said, I really was going for a big ambient, open kind of sound here, is the built-in verb here. Like I said, this is a feature of the Real Machines sound set. It's a kind of a plate. Let me turn that off and you'll notice it missing. Let's go back to the beginning of the section. It's a little busier and you can hear it without reverb. Just sounds super dry, right? Now let's add this in. Really creates a sense of space. Let's even solo that for a second. Yeah, that's just great. So that is the foundation of the rhythm section. And the other element in the rhythm section is this bass. It's the only one that's not from a true retro modeling synthesizer. This is Native Instruments Massive. But I really love Massive even for making Retrowave music because it's really versatile. You can make modern sounds with it, but you can also make really classic sounds with it. And this, I think, is from a collection of Italo disco style patches, maybe from Sample Magic. Again, you know me, I don't necessarily do very much sound design of my own. I love really searching through and finding inspiring presets and using those. This bass has a really interesting sound to it, has a lot of attack to it, but also a lot of sub-frequencies. Let me take it back to the A section. It is only in the A sections. It drops out for the breakdowns. Okay, let's talk about how I process that really quickly. Just in terms of inserts and stuff, I already talked about tuning the drums and the verb on the drums, but I don't have any inserts on the 808 except this, which isn't affecting its sound. It's related to the bass. This is basically me keying the ability to duck the low frequencies of the bass off of the drum kit. And I'll get to that in a second. But yeah, I didn't use any processing. I think I had used the M Auto Dynamic EQ just for some analyzing, use the analyzer, but no inserts here on the drum set. On the bass, however, I did more processing. So let me turn off my inserts. You can hear the preset just as it is from Massive. It has a nice chorus on. Let me turn it off and you'll notice it just is narrower and a little less lively. Now I'll turn it back on. I love a little bit of chorus on an old school synth. And then I used Slate VMR again. We've got the FGN again, but just like in the last case, I didn't use any of these bands for EQ. I did the tiniest bit of a high pass here, just a 30 hertz. That's like the lowest I think you can go, basically, just to try to edge out some of the very lowest end of the bass. And I ended up doing more to that later, I'll show you. And again, some of the drive, just a little bit to add a little bit of harmonic saturation. And then a good old 1176. This is wide open, so you get all the attack and a fast release. These both made a big difference. Let me turn them on in sequence so you can hear what they do to the bass. These are bypassed. Now we'll bring in the FGN. Gives it a little more clarity. And now the 1176 compressor. Clearly that's adding some level, but it also is adding some characteristic thickness for the 1176. I have the ratio at a 12:1 here, so it's definitely compressing that dynamic range a lot. And that was sounding better, but it was still a little bit flabby to me. And so then I brought in Isotope Neutron to do some more stuff. Actually had two more compressors here in serial, a multiband, and just another shaving a little bit off with a 2:1 ratio at the end here. But this is what I mentioned before and wanted to show to you. So this EQ isn't doing any EQ except for it's using the low shelf in a dynamic mode. And the key is from the 808 set. So here, I'm going to play it without the drums in. You won't see much happening here. Nothing's happening down in the low end. All the low end of the bass is passing through just as it is. But if I turn on the 808 kit, the kit is going to duck the bass out of the way to make room for that big old 808 kick drum in the mix. And that trick is as old as the hills, using keying a sidechain off of a kick drum to the bass to move the bass out of the way for the attack of the kick drum and the low end of the kick drum. And that way you don't have a huge mess down at the very lowest part of the spectrum. I used a shelf starting at about 85 hertz, ducking just 3 decibels every time that kick hits. All right, so that's the rhythm section. Very characteristically 80s. And now what we have is the rhythm section, the melody, and the chords built up. Certainly enough to call it a song, even right now. Let's listen to those things together. And then we're going to talk just lastly about the ear candy, as I like to call it. That's the A section. Here's the B section. And there, right there, you have a large part of the arrangement. But let's finish this video by talking about the additional bells and whistles, sometimes literally, that really add to the personality of a song and provide those special moments for the listener. So again, just recapping the process here, we started with the melody, then we rolled out a structure so that we knew where the A and the B section would be, and we really had a viable structure from beginning to end of the song. Harmonized that using some pads, built in a rhythm section with a drum kit and a bass. And then these purple tracks are our ear candy. So let's start with this one. This is from a Matrix 6, basically a Matrix 6 replica, also from the UVI OB Legacy. It's called the M-6K, but the Matrix 6 was another famous Oberheim 80s analog synthesizer. This time it was a 6-voice analog synth from 1986, I believe, and it actually followed after the Matrix 12, if my memory serves me. But this one is just playing a little bit of a sweep here, and it is to layer upon the main pad. So let's listen to it by itself. Nice bit of panning there. It's the delay, I think, sending it to the other side as well. Just delay and reverb from the patch again. I didn't do any inserts on here, looks like. And that was really just to layer upon here, upon this main OBXA kind of pad. Let's listen to them together. Yeah, they sound really nice together, very ethereal. Another layer comes from a second instance of the UVX80. Again, this is the same library from which I drew the main melody. It's another Akai AX80 kind of a patch. And this is an interesting one. This preset is sort of half pad, half ARP. Take a listen to this. And that ARP is sort of has a progressive filter where it gets more and more filtered up to the high end. And all I did on this one, similar to the melody, was to high pass it using the Melda Production M-Auto Dynamic EQ. Not quite as aggressively. I'm at about 150 hertz, but that's because it really is just a high end kind of a sound. You can hear the ARP get progressively smaller and smaller, or thinner and thinner, I should say. And that just provides a bit of an additional layer to the pads at the end of the A section. So let's just play those three together, the main pad, the Matrix 6 sweep, and that pad/ARP on top of each other. Start from just before the midway point here. Yeah, they have a nice synergy, just a warm, sparkling kind of a sound. And then we just have two more instruments to go here. Again, there was no processing really except for the high pass on either of those last ones. This is from one of my favorites. If you've been following the channel recently, you will know that I absolutely love the EMU Emulator 2. I did a very extensive and in-depth and detailed piece on that for the channel a little while ago. I'll be sure to provide a link in the description and maybe in the cards to this video. And what I did in that video was talk about the history and the sound and the special nature of EMU's Emulator 2 and their Drumulator drum machine, and also how UVI have done a great job of capturing them with their Emulation 2 and Drumulation libraries. So this is a patch from their Emulation 2 library from UVI. And as I say in that video, that again, if you are into retro sampling stuff, definitely check out that video. One of the features, or rather one of the sounds for which the emulator was really known, are choirs and voices. So that's what we have here. very classic, kind of an 80s sampling keyboard sound. I did a little bit of processing again with Slate VMR here, and it was really to just bring the patch to life again. A little bit of high pass from the FGS, and nothing else, it looks like. And then some revival again for some shimmer. Let me A-B that. This is going to be bypassed. Activated. A little more lively, a little brighter. And that part is sort of a counterpoint to the melody. Actually, it serves two roles. So in the intro, it is almost the melody by itself before the main melody comes in. And then later in the A section, it is a counterpoint to the melody. So let me play you back that, and you can hear this emulator 2 voices in context. So it was on its own in the intro, and here in a bit it's going to contrast with the main melody. Yeah, just a wonderful sort of classic sampling keyboard kind of a sound, really ethereal, adds to that atmosphere a lot. And then the last thing we have is one of my favorites. So I already shared with you that we used a little bit of the Impact Soundworks Super Audio Cart PC library for this melody doubling. That was from the Amiga Paula chip. This is from the same library, but what we have here is a brass sound from an old school ad-lib card. Now, if you are a fan of FM synthesis at all, you will know that the flagship sort of line for that was Yamaha's DX line, introduced in the 80s, like the DX7. They were more sophisticated by far. They had 6 operators, and I won't go into what that means here, but a lot of the commercial, or I should say a lot of the professional keyboards with FM synthesis that Yamaha made in the 80s were 6 operator synths. A step down from that would be a 4-operator synth, and they made keyboards with that. Also, the OPN sound chip, and that whole line of sound chips, known, among other things, for being the YM2612 in the Sega Genesis, was a 4-operator FM synth. And if you're interested in those kind of sounds, on this channel I have quite a few things about that, because I'm working on an EP that is based on the sound of the Sega Genesis, and its OPN 4-operator FM chip was also from Yamaha. But even the lower step, kind of the lowest step in this ladder of FM synths, were the 2-operator single chip synths, like the one used in the ad-lib sound card. And you may not have known this if back in the day you were a PC gamer and you just wanted, a sound card. You thought it was just to play music for your games, but really what was going on inside of your computer was a 8 or 9 voice 2-operator FM synthesizer. And so this is a brass part from that kind of a synth. Let me play it for you dry. Right about here. It even has that characteristic gritty noise to it. So I have it playing that line in the B section, and then a little jazzy line here. Really like that part. One of my favorites. I did need some processing though, so it wouldn't sound super small and super cheesy. The first thing I did was VMR, and I did more to this one. Again, some high pass, and I didn't use the drive on the FGN this time, but I did use the FG401, which is a VCA compressor, to compress the signal. And then I used a little bit of custom series EQ here, in particular the high mid filter at 7K, just to add a little bit of brightness. Let's listen to that with the processing. Definitely is more alive. Let's bypass that and you can hear without. with. Again, these are subtle moves, but they make a big difference. Let's listen to the processing on this little phrase. Yeah, it definitely comes through more in the mix this way as well. And then I added one of my two favorite delay plugins. My two favorite workhorse delay plugins are UVI's Relayer, which is kind of their delay counterpoint to their Spark Verb Reverb plugin, which I already talked about. And then NI's, that's Native Instruments, Replica XT. It has this great vintage digital mode, which is wonderful for Retrowave music. And check out what I did with this. So the dry signal by itself was not panned. It was up the middle. But what I did here was I went into the panning, and what I did is I panned the dry signal hard right and the delay signal hard left, so it has a stereo image. And in the mix, it sounds like this. Listen to the right and left here. So you can clearly hear the dry signal on the right and a little bit of a delay afterward on the left. And it's that really kind of lo-fi vintage digital here. It has a quality knob, and I've turned it all the way down from high through medium and low down to crunch. So that delay itself is pretty crunchy. Let's solo up the right channel here. Yeah, so that's one of my favorite parts. It definitely sounds like an old school sound card, because that's what it is. And I love the idea of really meshing everything nostalgic, everything retro, everything 80s when it comes to synthesizers and sounds, from, a super high-end analog beast of a machine like the Oberheim OBX-A, or a classic drum machine like the Roland TR-808, with, samples from an ad-lib card. It doesn't that is a perfect cocktail in my mind for something really retro and nostalgic. So with that, we have walked our way through the entire arrangement, the entire instrumentation, and how I processed it. Let me just also show you a little bit of my master bus. These are all just metering plugins down here, things like Isotope Insight, which I use to make sure that I got the loudness right, etc. But these are the ones affecting the sound. Primarily, this is called the Infected Mushroom Pusher. It's a Waves plugin, and I really love it for shaping the master bus and getting it into shape, because you've got bands from low, mid, mids, and highs. And what you do when you turn these knobs up isn't you accentuate it with actually like parallel compression. And you can do that to taste. This little thing adds a touch, however much you want, of dynamic punch. That's like a transient emphasis. It has a clipper, so you can start to get your level up before you go to your maximizer. In the low band, you can choose the fundamental of the key of the song, which is great. So I've done that here. And listen to the difference this makes. Let me take it to the last theme, and you'll hear none of my bus processing. Of course, it's going to be much quieter, and then I'll add this stuff in. Okay, first layer was I Am Pusher from Waves to shape the bands, to give things a little more emphasis, and even a little bit of tiny bit of stereo imaging on the top end here. This will add some level because I'm using the clipper, actually probably a bit of level, but not the full amount. Like if I turn off this mid band, listen to the difference it's making. Or the sub lows. Bring it back. Just really anchors the low end. Yeah, Impusher has become really indispensable to me as a starting place to get my master bus sounding good in a lot of songs. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. The next thing, which really, again, is a good example of how simple and tiny moves can make a big difference to a song. This is the RC20 Retro Color from XLN Audio, the same people who do Addictive Drums. And I just love this so much this is one of my go-to plugins. I'm going to make a video about this by itself, I think, but for getting a Retrowave sound. It transforms things to just sound old, but in a super musical and pleasing way. I started with a preset called Cassette First Generation, but check this out. This magnitude slider looks like it's all the way down. It's not though. I have 1% of this effect. Listen to it out and then listen to it in. It's going to add just the tiniest bit of like the color of as if this was recorded to a cassette tape. Here's bypassed. Now let's activate it. You can turn off the modules here. Little noise, little saturation. This is what it would sound like if this was way up high. Like really flabby. But just the tiniest hint adds this nice little saturation and takes a little bit of the digital high end off that I really loved. I clipped there because I was turning up the intensity. All right, and then the last thing in the chain is always ozone for me. I used the Master Assistant, I think, as a starting place to get the bus shaped a little bit. But I added some of my own EQ here. Typical kinds of moves, added some upper mids here. Took a tiny bit off of the extreme top, a little bit of flab here around 400 hertz, I think. Yeah, 402 hertz. And just sort of shaping the bus. And then the dynamic EQ precedes the maximizer to sort of cut out dynamically some of the frequency ranges which might cause the maximizer to overact. And it just makes it more transparent. And then, you know, just bringing the threshold down and the ceiling down so that I get no clipping and I'm getting the loudness I want. I usually shoot for around 9 LUFS integrated, sometimes 10, sometimes as high as 8 is what I've shot for, but 9 is a good kind of midway point. You don't need to get things that hot nowadays with the loudness sort of wars on their way out. When it comes to streaming platforms like Spotify or YouTube, they're doing a lot to equal out, you know, loudness of tunes. But because SoundCloud is one of my main platforms and they don't have that in place yet, I try to make things competitive, but not horrendously loud. So yeah, I didn't have to really push down the maximizer very far here because I'd used the clipper on Impusher for part of the lifting. So that's my master bus here. It did do some shaping of the sound for sure. And that's pretty much it. So just to recap, this is a song called After Hours. I wanted you to see sort of my process of building a retro instrumental from the beginning to the end, both in terms of the philosophy and the method and the sounds. Again, I begin with a melody usually. I build chords around that, try to make both as interesting as possible. I roll out the structure as quickly as I can so that I don't get stuck in 8-bar loop land. Then add the rhythm section because that's another key component to any record. And then add all the interesting bits, bells and whistles, and the ear candy to really make sure that every moment of the song has something interesting happening. I showed you some of the processing. I definitely am not adverse to if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Leave it alone if it's sounding good. You don't always have to have everything on an aux. You don't always have to have, you know, go through and do a bunch of sound design on your presets or your reverbs or delay. If a preset works, run with it. And with that, I hope that you enjoyed this video and found it informative or useful. Please leave me a comment and let me know how I can serve you best in the future. If this kind of video is something you're interested in, please tell me what you liked about this and also what else you'd like me to add or change in the future. On this channel with the Ghost Mall, I share lots of stuff about Retrowave music production and also my own music and also stuff about songwriting and music theory in general. So if that interests you, please feel free to subscribe to the channel. If you like this, you can hit that like button and that way it'll be saved to your liked videos. You can find it again. Don't forget that you can download After Hours for free from the link in the description on my Bandcamp. I'll include that. And with that, I will say thanks so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this, and I look forward to seeing you on another video soon. Keep it retro and take it easy, guys.